We're going on a fascinating journey exploring how your brain interacts with the world, specifically through the lens of neurodiversity in women.
Oh, I love that.
And, to guide us, Jenara Nerenberg's Divergent Mind.
It's a great book.
I think it's got such a great mix of personal stories, science,
Oh, yeah.
some historical context. The whole works.
Absolutely. A rich tapestry of information, yeah.
So before we get lost in those amazing details, what's like the one big takeaway that someone brand new to this idea should walk away with?
Yeah. Nerenberg is really trying to change the conversation around neurological differences, right? So things like ADHD, autism, even just being highly sensitive. She's arguing these aren't deficits, there's just variations in how our brains work.
Right.
And Divergent Mind, it focuses on how this plays out, especially for women.
It makes me think, have you ever felt like the way you process the world is just different, maybe more intense, or you're sensitive to things that other people just kind of brush off?
Yeah, and that's a common thread throughout the book. And it ties into these 5 neurodivergences that she really explores in detail.
5.
5. High sensitivity, ADHD, autism, sensory processing disorder, and synesthesia.
Okay, so 5, and sensitivity is the common link you said.
Exactly. Think about some of the things we see.
Some of them really did resonate with me.
Interesting.
There's one that says, I find myself needing to withdraw during busy days into bed or a darkened room or any place where I can have some privacy and relief from stimulation.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, honestly, after a long day, I crave quiet time more than anything.
Well, and that's such a classic example of how sensitivity can manifest, right? So if you find yourself relating to these statements, it's like a little clue. Yeah.
That it might be worth exploring this further.
So then why a whole book dedicated to the female experience? What makes it so unique?
Well, think about Sarah Seeger, for example, who's featured in the book. She's a successful astrophysicist
Wow.
at MIT, and she wasn't diagnosed with Asperger's until adulthood.
Really?
Yeah, and it kind of highlights this key point that often neurodiversity in women goes unnoticed,
Interesting.
leading to these later diagnoses, even for women who accomplish incredible things.
I wonder what causes that delay, though. Is it about the way the symptoms present or societal expectations? What's at play there?
It's multifaceted, really. Societal expectations definitely play a role.
Yeah.
Women are often expected to be more social, more emotionally expressive, and that can mask certain neurodivergent traits.
Right.
There's also medical bias. Some diagnostic criteria are still based on male presentations of these conditions.
So it's almost like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Yes.
Using a framework that wasn't built for you. Nerenberg argues that this constant pressure to conform, to mask your true self,
Right.
that contributes to the higher rates of anxiety and depression that we see in neurodivergent women.
Yeah, I can see how trying to constantly fit in when your brain is just wired differently could take a real toll.
Oh, absolutely. And it feeds into this misconception that Divergent Mind really tries to challenge.
Okay.
This idea that neurodiversity is just about anxiety.
Oh, so it's more nuanced than that.
It's way more nuanced. What Nerenberg says is that anxiety often stems from this, sensory overload, the effort of masking, not the neurodivergence itself.
Okay.
Like take misophonia, for instance. This is an extreme sensitivity to specific sounds.
Like chewing.
Like chewing, exactly.
Oh, I've heard of that. I've never really thought of it in the context of this bigger conversation about neurodiversity, though.
It adds a whole other layer to it.
Right, it does.
Shows how diverse these experiences can be.
So we've talked about sensitivity, masking, the challenges women face. What about relationships? How does neurodiversity play out in those dynamics?
Oh, that's another key area that Nerenberg looks at. So, Divergent Mind features these 2 contrasting couples. We have Denise and Tim, who find comfort in shared sensitivities.
Yeah.
Then there's Isabel and Dan, who have different neurotypes, and that creates some friction initially.
Ooh. Tell me about Isabel and Dan. Their story sounds interesting.
Yeah. So Isabel, she identifies as both ADHD and autistic, and Dan really thrives on systems and routines.
Okay.
And so they clash over things like Isabel's tendency to be late, which Dan finds frustrating.
Right.
But what's interesting is their differences ultimately lead them to a deeper understanding and acceptance.
That's a good reminder that even with different neurotypes, strong relationships are still possible.
Yeah.
Sounds like communication is key, though.
Oh, absolutely. And Nerenberg takes that idea beyond personal relationships, too, arguing that workplaces need to embrace neurodiversity as well.
Okay.
She talks about this concept of temperament rights.
Temperament rights. What is that? That sounds almost radical.
It is a powerful idea. It's basically acknowledging that everyone has this unique neurological makeup, right?
Yeah.
And those differences deserve respect, just like any other form of diversity.
So instead of asking people to adapt to this rigid work environment, we should be designing workplaces that celebrate and accommodate different ways of thinking and working.
That's it. And Nerenberg even showcases companies like SAP and Microsoft who are creating these inclusive hiring programs
Okay.
specifically for neurodivergent individuals.
It's really cool to see those big companies kind of taking the lead there. It suggests a real shift, I think, in how we see and value neurodiversity.
Yeah, and it connects back to Nerenberg's main argument, right? That this is a strength, not a weakness.
Yeah.
And these companies are realizing the unique talents that neurodivergent employees bring to the table.
Right. It makes me think about something Nerenberg mentioned, this idea of wilt,
Yeah.
how each of us experiences the world through this unique sensory lens. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Welt is a fascinating concept. It highlights this idea that what's normal for one person can be totally different for someone else.
Okay.
Especially when you consider our sensory experiences.
So my normal might be someone else's sensory overload.
Exactly.
And vice versa.
Yeah, and Nerenberg connects this to design.
Oh, interesting.
Thinking about things like natural light,
Okay.
calming colors, sensory-rich spaces, things that can benefit everyone, but especially neurodivergent individuals.
So it's about creating spaces that are sensitive to our individual welts, like our own ways of experiencing the world.
Yeah.
It's making me rethink, like everything from office spaces to my own home environment. Are there actual examples of this happening?
There's a growing trend of sensory-friendly design, in schools, workplaces, even sports arenas.
Wow, the world is catching on.
It is.
Nerenberg doesn't stop there, though. She talks about echolocation to illustrate this idea of redefining normal.
Yes. Echolocation, that's where blind individuals use sound to see, right?
Right.
Nerenberg uses this as an example of the brain's adaptability and how what we might perceive as limitations can actually be strengths.
That's amazing.
Right.
So it's not just about creating accommodating spaces, but really rethinking what's considered normal in the first place.
That's the core message of Divergent Mind. Challenging assumptions, embracing differences, and really celebrating these unique ways that our brains work.
This is such a great start to our deep dive. We've already covered so much, from these personal stories to these fascinating scientific concepts, but I know there's still so much more to explore.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll be back soon with more insights from Divergent Mind.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Divergent Mind. Still thinking about this idea that neurodiversity isn't a deficit.
Right.
It's just a different way of thinking and being in the world.
Yeah, that's a huge part of what Nerenberg's arguing, shifting our perspective to see these differences as strengths.
So let's dig into some of those strengths. So we talked about sensitivity, but Divergent Mind also covers sensory processing disorder, or SPD.
Yeah, and that's one that's getting more attention, I think.
Okay.
It's not officially in the DSM yet.
The what?
Oh, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
Got it.
But it's a condition where people process sensory information differently.
Okay, so what would that look like in someone's life, day to day?
Well, imagine, feeling overwhelmed by the feel of certain fabrics.
Okay.
Or not being able to focus when there's background noise, things like that.
Yeah.
For some people, even just everyday sensations can be intensely uncomfortable or even painful.
It sounds exhausting.
It can be, yeah. And, most people don't think about how their brains filter and process that sensory information
Right.
until they meet someone who struggles with it.
Divergent Mind has some pretty powerful stories from women with SPD, right?
He does, yeah.
Anything that particularly stood out to you?
There's Lisa. She's an art teacher with 3 kids.
Okay.
And she's highly sensitive to touch and sound. But she also has dyspraxia, which affects coordination and movement.
Wow. I mean, dealing with those sensitivities while also being a mom and a teacher
Yeah.
must be so challenging.
It is, but Nerenberg really highlights how Lisa has found ways to manage her SPD,
Okay.
using tools and techniques to regulate that sensory input and just make her environment more comfortable.
That's hopeful.
Yeah,
So even though there are real challenges, there are ways to cope and make life better.
absolutely. And Nerenberg talks about things like occupational therapy, which can be so helpful.
Yeah.
It focuses on developing skills to better process sensory information so you can participate more fully in daily life.
I think there's so much we can learn from people who navigate the world differently, too.
Great.
I mean, their strategies for sensory overload could help anyone, not just those with SPD.
That's such a good point. It comes back to embracing neurodiversity. We can learn from each other.
Yeah. We talked about how SPD impacts daily life, but what about relationships,
Hmm.
especially intimate ones?
Yeah, so Norenberg addresses that too. She talks
Yeah.
about how differences in sensory preferences, can cause misunderstandings or conflict.
Like one person might love being touched, the other finds it overwhelming.
Exactly.
It sounds like being open and communicating is so key.
It really is. And Nirenberg actually argues that understanding SPD can make relationships stronger.
Interesting.
When partners are aware of those sensitivities, they can create a more harmonious environment, right?
It's just like anything else in a relationship. Communication and understanding are so important.
Mm-hmm.
So Divergent Mind goes beyond those personal stories
Mm-hmm.
and gets into some cool brain research too, right?
Oh, definitely. One area that Nirenberg digs into is the research on mirror neurons.
Mirror neurons. Remind me what those are again.
Okay, so these are specialized cells in the brain that fire both when we do an action and when we watch someone else doing that same action.
So you're saying that when I watch you pick up your coffee, the same neurons are firing in my brain
Yeah,
as if I was reaching for it myself.
exactly. Pretty wild, right?
That is wild. How does this connect to neurodiversity, though?
Well, researchers think that differences in mirror neuron activity might actually contribute to the social and communication challenges that some neurodivergent people experience.
Okay.
It's like their brains might be processing those social cues differently, which can lead to those misunderstandings or make it harder to connect.
I wonder if those communication challenges are often misinterpreted by people.
Uh-huh.
Like maybe it's not a lack of empathy, but a difference in how those signals are processed in the brain.
That's a really insightful point, and it highlights the need for more awareness about neurodiversity.
Almost like we need a new language for communicating
Mm.
that takes into account these neurological differences.
Yeah. And Nirenberg even touches on the history of how neurodiversity has been viewed and treated, which is pretty fascinating.
Okay, let's talk about that because it seems like our understanding of the brain,
Mm.
especially neurodiversity, has changed so much over time.
It really has. And Nirenberg actually doesn't shy away from the darker side of that history.
Uh,
In earlier centuries, much of what was labeled as madness, especially in women,
Right.
was influenced by social and economic factors.
So it wasn't always just about individual differences, but how those differences were judged by society.
Exactly. And that historical context is so important for understanding the stigma that still exists today around neurodiversity.
Makes you realize that what we consider normal is always changing,
Mm-hmm.
and we have to be careful about these rigid definitions we put on behavior.
Absolutely. And Nirenberg's point is that we need to look at neurodiversity with a critical eye, questioning those assumptions,
Yeah.
acknowledging the impact of history and society.
So it's not just about understanding the brain, but understanding how our perceptions of the brain are shaped by culture.
You got it. This is all fascinating, but I'm wondering, what does it actually look like to live well with neurodiversity? Does Divergent Mind offer any guidance on that?
It does, yeah. Nerenberg talks a lot about creating a sense of home, both physically and in our relationships.
Okay, I like that.
What does she mean by that, especially for someone who's neurodivergent?
Well, she says our homes should be havens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Spaces where we feel safe and comfortable,
Good.
where our sensory needs are met.
Yeah.
She even ties this back to WELT, creating a home environment that aligns with our sensory experiences.
So if I'm someone who's overwhelmed by noise and clutter,
Mm-hmm.
my home might be totally different from someone who thrives on a lot of stimulation.
Exactly. And she has some great practical tips for that incorporating nature.
Okay.
Culbing colors, minimizing overload.
It's not just our physical spaces, though, right?
Right.
She talks about relationships as part of that home, too.
Absolutely. It's so important to find understanding partners and friends,
Yeah.
people who appreciate your needs and quirks.
Hmm.
She even has stories of couples who've navigated this in their relationships.
We don't have to do this alone.
No, we don't. And finding those supportive relationships can make a world of difference.
Absolutely. But those relationships go beyond our personal lives, too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nirenberg talks about work and neurodiversity.
Yeah, that's a big one. For a lot of people, that's where those feelings of being different are the strongest.
Exactly. So what does she say about navigating that?
She talks about advocating for yourself, communicating your needs, finding roles that really play to your strengths.
Sounds like a balancing act. Being true to yourself, but also working within a system that might not get it.
It is, and she acknowledges that, especially for women who often face extra biases and expectations.
So it's not just the job, but advocating for a more inclusive environment.
Yeah, exactly. She really encourages readers to learn about their own minds,
Yep.
design their lives accordingly, and communicate those needs at work.
Makes sense.
It's about empowering yourself with knowledge
Yeah.
and finding allies who can support you.
I like that. Nerenberg also talks about the power of community, right?
Yes. Connecting with other neurodivergent people, both online and offline.
Finding spaces where you feel seen, not judged, or pressured to conform.
Exactly. Those communities are so validating, especially if you felt isolated.
It's like finding your people, you know?
It is. And they can be a great source of information and support. Nerenberg mentions organizations and websites that offer help
That's odd.
for neurodivergent folks and families.
It's encouraging to see this growing support network for neurodivergent people. Feels like a real shift in attitudes.
It does. And Nerenberg ends Divergent Mind on a hopeful note,
Okay.
encouraging readers to embrace their neurology, celebrate their strengths, and push for a world that values all minds.
What a great message. It really ties into everything we've talked about. Moving beyond these limited ideas of normal and recognizing the diversity of the human brain.
I couldn't agree more. Divergent Mind is a reminder that we all have unique contributions to make. Our differences make us human.
We've covered so much ground, from those personal stories of women to the research that's changing how we think about the brain. But we're not done yet. There's one more aspect of Divergent Mind I want to dig into.
Okay, what is it?
I'm fascinated by the idea of neurodiversity as a source of creativity and innovation.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like Nerenberg hints at that throughout the book.
She does.
And I want to unpack that a little more.
Yeah, it's an important point. We often focus on the challenges, but there's so much potential for creativity when we embrace those different ways of thinking.
Right. It's like our traditional systems, education, work are holding us back.
In a way, yeah. Think about it. We reward conformity, linear thinking, and this narrow definition of what success looks like. But what about those who think outside the box, who see patterns others miss?
Exactly. Like, we're missing out on so much creativity because we aren't making space for those minds to flourish.
Right. And Nerenberg points to people like Temple Grandin, the autistic animal scientist who revolutionized livestock facilities. Her unique perspective led to a much more humane approach.
It's amazing how often innovation comes from people who see the world differently.
And Divergent Mind really challenges us to rethink those environments, education, work.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to fix people, what if we celebrated their abilities?
What if? Imagine what we could achieve.
Right. It's an exciting thought, and it goes back to Nerenberg's message of embracing difference, seeing the value in every mind.
That's a perfect way to put it. Well, I think we've come to the end of our deep dive into Divergent Mind. It's been such a journey.
It really has. I've learned so much.
Me too. I feel like I've learned so much about myself, about the brain, about this whole idea of neurodiversity.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
If you're feeling inspired to learn more, Divergent Mind is a great place to start.
It is. And remember, it's not about deficits. It's about different ways of being. Those differences make us who we are.
So true. Embrace your neurology, celebrate your strengths, and advocate for a world that values all minds.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive on Divergent Mind. It's been such a thought-provoking conversation.
It really has so much to unpack, even in these excerpts.
You know, as we've been talking, I keep coming back to this idea of neurodiversity as a wellspring of creativity, of innovation.
Absolutely.
It feels like it's woven throughout the book.
It is, yeah.
And I'd love to dive a little deeper into that with you.
Let's do it.
Because it makes me wonder if, our traditional systems like education, the workplace, if they're actually stifling that potential.
I think that's a very valid concern.
Yeah.
Think about it. We often prioritize conformity, this linear way of thinking.
Right.
This very narrow definition of what success looks like.
Yeah.
But what about those who think outside the box? The ones who see patterns that others miss, who come at problems from a totally different angle?
I mean, it's like we're missing out on this whole spectrum of creativity.
Yeah.
Because we're not making space for those minds to thrive.
Exactly. And Nerenberg gives some really compelling examples of neurodivergent individuals making groundbreaking contributions in all sorts of fields. Like, remember Temple Grandin?
Oh, yeah. The autistic animal scientist?
Right. The one who totally revolutionized livestock facilities.
Yeah.
I mean, her way of seeing the world led to a much more humane and efficient approach.
It's amazing how often those who challenge the status quo, who see things differently are the ones who drive those big innovations.
It's true. And, Divergent Mind is a real push to rethink those environments, like in education and workplaces.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to fix neurodivergent individuals, what if we created spaces where their unique abilities were celebrated?
I love that. What if, right, just imagine the possibility.
It's an exciting thought, and it really speaks to that bigger idea of embracing difference and seeing the value in every single mind.
That's beautifully said. Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Divergent Mind.
Already. Feels like we just started.
It's flown by, but it's been such an incredible journey for me.
For me, too.
I feel like I've learned so much about myself, about the brain, this whole world of neurodiversity.
It's been a real pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And for those who want to keep going, Divergent Mind is a fantastic place to start.
Oh, it is, yeah. And just remember, it's not about deficits.
Right.
It's about different ways of being, and it's those differences that make us human.
So true. Embrace your unique neurology, celebrate your strengths, and advocate for a world where all minds are valued.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time.